David Clark.
Speaker, I rise following that very mediocre speech from the member opposite to outline a few points about why we would support such a bill despite its various inadequacies. Look, the Labour Party does support all attempts to make sure that people do pay back what they've been loaned, that it's done in a fair way, and that everyone pays their fair share. But the way that this bill is structured does begin to hint at some of the other things that we've seen recently in terms of restricting access and opportunity. And I want to say a little bit about the repayment holiday changes as I go on. We've seen already in the last 2 years a series of restrictions placed on tens of thousands of New Zealanders who've been cut out of higher education through 55-year-olds and over, new migrants, pilot trainees, part-time students, and John Key's statement last week suggests that student loans are going to be reined in a big way. They're not finished yet. But this bill is more of an effort to tinker around the edges. But it does, at the same time, affect the hundreds of thousands of Kiwis who depend on them. Mr. Speaker, the bill would exclude investment and business losses from the calculation of net income in assessing student loan repayments. Now, this does present a risk where significant losses from someone starting their own business soon after university may then have to borrow more or make other arrangements in order to meet repayment requirements. Various submitters raised questions about this in the Select Committee, but the government would not resile from it. The bill does require alternative contact details be supplied as a precondition of accessing a student loan, and presumably the thinking behind that is to provide an alternative contact point for tracking down defaulters. Now, if that's handled in a way that is true to what we believe to be the intention of the bill as the government's outlined it, that won't be a particular problem, as long as it is carefully policed and the government remains true to its objective of merely tracking down those who are defaulting on their loans. But as we've seen, the efforts so far have been generally in the direction of clawback, and so we retain a few nervousnesses around that. The changes around the repayment holidays are the ones that have concerned me, Mr. Speaker. The members opposite wish to rein in the repayment holiday and make it just 1 year rather than 3 years. We argued around the Select Committee about the merits of this proposal or otherwise, and were clear that this would affect likely those who were second chance learners unfairly, those who perhaps have already repaid a student loan and decide to go back and take on another one. Now, if I was to take out a mortgage, Mr. Speaker, repay that mortgage and carry on with my life for some period of time, then decide to take out another mortgage, I would expect to face the same conditions with that second mortgage as with the first one I'd taken out. With student loans, as it's proposed around this repayment holiday, that is not the case. A person is not entitled to a second repayment holiday under this legislation. Now, that will disadvantage disproportionately those who have gone out, sought some education as a young person and decided that they couldn't cope, or if it wasn't for them at that stage, they've got gainful employment, gradually paid down their student loan, then came back with a real ambition in mind, determined to get ahead, determined to make the best for themselves and their family, taking out a second student loan. Suddenly their opportunity set is restricted. And this is the kind of change we come to expect from the opposition. We've challenged this. They've said that this is something they're sticking to. We asked for further information on it. It was very slow in being forthcoming. The mortgage repayment example is a fair one, Mr. Speaker, and I think that everyone should have the opportunity to have fair conditions when they take out their loan and expect to have the opportunity to face that loan in the same way as they would at any other point in their lives. A few statistics. $17,000 is the average student loan held currently, and 58% of the borrowers are women. And when I talk about those that are faced with that reduced opportunity set, I think we should bear in mind that 58% of those who are borrowing are women, and 70 to 80% of eligible borrowers take on a loan. So this does affect a lot of New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker. So I think we should provide the opportunity for people to retrain, and particularly those who are motivated so to do. Restricting future options for our citizens that want to better themselves seems counterintuitive. Labor is determined that the principles of fairness and opportunity should win out, in this case as in all cases. Mr. Speaker, the bill also inserts clauses 7b to 7e to reflect, and I quote, current administrative practices regarding the repayment codes used for income tax and student loan repayments. The treatment specified in the Student Loans Scheme Act 2011 was designed in anticipation of changes to the IRD's computer system, which will now not be made. These changes, Mr. Speaker, will not be made because that computer system was a flop. Millions of dollars were poured into Oracle for mainframe redevelopments, and they were subsequently written off. And that raises a very important question around this, and that is to do with the major project that the department that will be administering this legislation is about to embark upon, and that is an estimated spend of $1 to $1.5 billion on overhauling a computer system to manage our tax take. Now, $1 to $1.5 billion over 10 years is not as big as Texas, but it's certainly bigger than INSIS. So we need to be very careful that when we are dealing with this new computer system that's being put in, it should, I think, be able to cope with the kinds of changes that were anticipated in the smaller investment in Oracle for the original mainframe developments. It seems to me strange that we should be now taking amendments to the legislation in order to cope with a computer system that didn't work when a bigger one that theoretically should work is planned. One has to ask, do the government opposite not have faith in their officials and in the contracts that they're letting, and are they not sure that they can carry out the work that they have promised with this amendment? My colleague Grant Robertson mentioned earlier that the Treasury and the Ministry of Education had cast aspersions on the IRD's calculations for estimated savings that are likely to eventuate. And this is worrying because this legislation, by one calculation, will cost us approximately, or cost the taxpayer, I should say more correctly, approximately $2,761,000 to pass. A calculation done for me by the Parliamentary Library says that's what it costs to pass a bill in this Parliament. And we've got to wonder in this case whether when we're passing a bill that hopes to regain $15 million from the taxpayer, whether that is money well spent, especially when the Ministry of Education and the Treasury have questioned whether this bill actually achieves what it sets out to achieve, Mr. Speaker. So in order to conclude, I wish to just recap that Labor will indeed support this legislation, but it supports it with reservations, and that is around the repayment holiday, the way in which that has been put in place, or is intended to be put in place to restrict the opportunities of second chance learners, and that is because Labor always supports fairness and opportunity. We want to see people get ahead, where they want to work hard, where they want to make the opportunity to better themselves and better their lot for themselves and their families. Labor wants to support that. We've seen from the National Party restrictions to student loan eligibility, which have seen tens of thousands of New Zealanders shut out of higher education. And more is promised. John Key needs to come clean on what he is planning for student loans, as hundreds of thousands of Kiwis depend on them. So these restrictions that have been placed on 55-year-olds, new migrants, pilot trainees, part-time students and so on are not the end of it. Labor wants to see fairness and opportunity, not a bill that tinkers around the edge, aiming to get back just 0.12 of 1% back in an estimate that has been described by officials as a guess. We want to see this money come back to New Zealand where it's due, that much is true, but we also want to see a system that is fair in place, that supports Kiwis who are working hard to get ahead, who are bettering themselves for the future of us all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Green Party will